Emily Dickinson and her impact on the literary world. Emily Coppola, Bluefield State College, Major American Authors, Spring 2018. It isn't often that a poet can impact the literary world outside of the poetry realm, and it is even less often that a poet can leave such a lasting impression that 132 years after their death they are still relevant and raved about. Emily Dickinson and her work has done just that. Not only is her work still being studied, but she is also still inspiring writers across the globe. Dickinson's unordinary subjects and writing styles have placed her at the top of the poetry spectrum. Though, through her life, Dickinson faced many challenges, and these altered her work, that didn't stop her from becoming successful. Dickinson's life is incredibly important when studying her work, because through her unorthodox lifestyle, her work takes new meaning. Through her own hardships, her theories, and ideals, Dickinson created literary work that has impacted the literary world in only a way that she can. Dickinson can be more fully appreciated and understood through her time, writing style, subject, and her two poems, Because I Could Not Stop for Death and I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. In essence, Dickinson's life was not that of other writers of her time. While other writers were striving to publish their works and spread their names across the world, Dickinson was instead living as a recluse inside of her home. She was pulled from school at a young age, though the reason for this is unknown. She was seen, as I've stated before, less and less by the public eye until she fully became a recluse, and to even further her recluse lifestyle, she never married. She never considered publishing her works. Though some of them were published during her life, it is now known that they were published without her consent, anonymously, and that all of her stylistic choices were edited out of them upon publishing. Dickinson never identified with a religion, so she was left to wonder about the happenings of the universe and what was to happen upon her death. I believe that through this wonderment, Dickinson developed a sort of comfort and infatuation with death. It wasn't necessarily that she was infatuated with dying, per se, but rather she found comfort in the idea of death being a personified thing. Since she didn't believe in a higher power or that anything was really consistent and steadfast in the world, I think that the thought of death to her was comforting because she knew that there was one thing that was inevitable and there was one thing that no one could escape. And, as you can imagine, by spending all of her time alone in the containment of her home, she had a lot of time to sit and think. She wasn't made famous for her poetry and her literary work until she died and her sister found her poems. Sadly, on May 15, 1886, Dickinson passed away from kidney disease and finally met with death. Disregarding conventional syntax and punctuation, Dickinson created her own literary style completely. By way of dashes and unorthodox capitalization, Dickinson made her poetry into a new creation. Her style choices, previously her biggest criticism by readers of her time, are her most admired feature now, which is ironic. In Dickinson's Facing or Turning Away, Mary Coppola makes the argument that the dashes and spaces are to provoke and diminish feelings simultaneously. This is an interesting argument because while her words evoke strong feelings, the dashes do the opposite. The dashes pull the reader's attention away from one line to the other, or from one thought to the next. This would also make the argument that her stylistic choices are more than just a means of ushering thought. Further than her stylistic choices, her subject matter also takes an interesting turn. While most of her poems are about death and interactions she has with death, some of her poems do take a complete 180 and focus on subjects of nature. Douglas Anderson uses interesting word choice regarding Dickinson's acknowledgement of life and presence and place in Emily Dickinson's poetry. That it isn't necessarily life she acknowledges, but presence. By focusing on the end of life and the acknowledgement of life, Dickinson is linking death and life into one. Douglas Anderson has created a beautiful piece of analyzation regarding Dickinson's work, and he studies one of her poems, There Is Another Sky, in particular, and uses it to prove that Dickinson showcases human life as being intimate and local by creating heaven, as we are used to being far away, instead with it being local and close, right outside the window of her own home in her garden. This in turn would mean that in story space, death wouldn't be something to fear because heaven would be on earth and those we love who pass away would not be lost. The presence used in Dickinson's poems isn't always the presence of a speaker per se, or even a living thing around them. Sometimes it's just the presence of nothing at all. Two of Dickinson's most famous poems, Because I Could Not Stop for Death and I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, are arguably the epitome of Dickinson's unique work. Not only do these two poems showcase her stylistic flair, the use of dashes, but also her unusual subject matter. Because I Could Not Stop for Death not only personifies death, but also creates an intimate bond between herself and death. The role that death takes on in this poem is less of the Grim Reaper that we're used to, and more of a respectable suitor coming to take her out. The personification and bond are both made during the first stanza. The first stanza reads, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. Dickinson personifies and also genders death by capitalizing his presumed name, which is death, classifies it as a he, and says that he is kind enough to stop for her. The other words capitalized in the stanza, carriage, ourselves, and immortality, could play as the informer of these subjects to show that they are as important and alive as she and death are herselves. The dashes in the stanza don't take the place of punctuation, but rather are used to aid in flow and structure of the piece. Later in the poem, Dickinson labels death as having civility, which furthers the bond between herself and death. In I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, the presence follows that of Anderson's aforementioned thoughts on her use of presence. As the speaker lies dying, or dead, it isn't necessarily clear which is the truth. The room around her literally and figuratively buzzes with life. The first stanza reads, I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. Not only does this label the room as being bursting and alive, but it also uses irony as well. She illustrates the stillness of the room, or the air in the room, as being as still as that of the air during a storm, which transfers the scene of her lying quietly on her deathbed to that of a raging storm at sea. This poem also uses dashes, but these are more sporadic than the previous one. These dashes could be used to simulate the disruption of the atmosphere of death by that of the fly in the room. As the speaker is passing away, the life around her, the air, the fly, the presence of all of it is ever present. But ultimately, it isn't the life of the people standing around her that's mentioned in one of the later stanzas that she focuses on. Instead, it's the fly buzzing around her. This is very characteristic of Dickinson's work, as she is not one to be similar to that of other writers. Dickinson will always be the example of not following the typical way of doing things, but still reaching success. To conclude, Dickinson's work is one that has stood the test of time and will continue to influence writers for countless years. Despite the trials she faced in her life, Dickinson created beautiful work. Her work left a lasting impression on the literary world, not only because of her unusual syntax, but also because of her subject matter as well. Dickinson lived an unusual life, as you can see, that resulted in her not receiving her heightened fame during her life, but only after her death. By way of dashes and an unorthodox capitalization, Dickinson received mass amounts of interest in her writing and paved the way for others creating their own styles. Dickinson can be more fully appreciated and understood through her life, writing style, subject, and her two poems, Because I Could Not Stop for Death and I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. Dickinson's choice of subject matter also leaves the reader wondering what she thought would happen once she died, and what she truly thought of death.